All right, so as Adrian said, I'm Stephen McGee. I'm with the Learning Partnership, was a small consulting group based out of Chicago. So there's a whole host of people that have been involved with this project. So we're talking about a project that started several years ago in Chicago called Taste of Computing. Those from the Chicago area might know it's a playoff of Taste of Chicago, which is a big food festival in Grant Park every year. And it began as a partnership with Loyola University, DePaul, University of Illinois, Chicago, to bring exploring computer science to Chicago, and specifically the Chicago Public Schools. And so Gail Chapman from UCLA is one of the co-authors of the Exploring Computer Science curriculum. Of course, the big news out of Chicago, which isn't so new, is back in February, the school board approved that computer science is now a graduation requirement in Chicago. So in a few weeks, the 21-some thousand students who are coming as freshmen, sometime in the next 4 years, all of them will take a computer science course. So that's pretty exciting that we'll see a huge increase in the number of students being exposed to computer science. And that didn't come out of nowhere. So the group in Chicago has been working for several years to try to promote more computer science in Chicago. And so back in the 2011-2012 school year, when we first started, primarily computer science was based out of the Career and Technical Education program. So there's a whole IT track. It wasn't necessarily computer science. It was more focused on information technology as a field, might involve tech support or Microsoft certification. So one of the original hopes of Taste of Computing was to bring computer science into the information technology track for students. And then as it got adopted, CPS started to expand to say we want CS for all. In fact, they developed the Twitter handle of the CS for all, since Obama stole the name, CS for All for the Nation. But it started to expand beyond career and technical education to become more of an elective course. So you can see the growth in the number of schools over the last 5 years that are offering any kind of computer science course. And so right now that represents a little under half of the 137 high schools in Chicago. So they still have a long way to go to be able to offer every school having at least one computer science course. What's interesting is that there's been a bigger increase in the number of students. So I think what we're seeing is that there's schools expanding, but within schools we're seeing expansion in the number of students that are actually taking a computer science course. I've highlighted the 12, 13, and 13, 14 school years in larger blocks. That's the focus of this particular study. We actually have a data sharing agreement with the Chicago Public Schools where they give us all of the data about every student that's enrolled in any computer science class. So that's the data set that we'll be examining today. There's been a big increase in the number of students, and as of last year, it represents about half of the size of the freshman class. So they still have a long way to go, but they have 4 years to get there. Because the students have to take at least some time before they graduate, so they don't have to all take it as a freshman. So this particular study is focused on the Exploring Computer Science curriculum, and how many people are already familiar with that program? So yes, a big chunk of people, but for some it's a new, you haven't heard of this program before. It's been developed by Jane Margolis and Joanna Good and Gail Chapman as part of Jane's work, Unlocking the Clubhouse and Stuck in the Shallow End. Some of the research on barriers for women and underrepresented groups going into computer science took that and developed a curriculum to actually address some of those barriers. There's 3 pillars that underlie the curriculum. One of the things I thought was interesting, I didn't, in the panel last night, where they talked about the announcement for CS for All and the fact that diversity was not something that was at all mentioned as part of that announcement, was not something that I had necessarily picked up on. And so I think what's interesting is that for ECS, that's actually equity and diversity as a core principle upon which everything else is built. And it's the idea that you build on cultural wealth of the students, build a culture of caring in the classroom where everyone has the opportunity to participate, and that you focus on computer science for real-life issues. And upon that foundation, then, is a focus on inquiry, where students are asking questions, they're developing their own knowledge, and it's very collaborative. And one of the core, then, is that it's not designed to be sort of a toy, fun curriculum, that even though you're sort of focused on real-world issues and collaborating, you're still actually learning fundamental computer science concepts. Just by way of example, so this is an example of sort of building on cultural wealth. So it focuses on a particular cultural practice around hairstyles and allows students to sort of investigate what are some algorithmic properties to how this artistic style is actually developed. So this is one of the examples that's actually in the ECS curriculum. And the goal for the teachers is to actually have them develop examples that matches sort of the cultural wealth of their own students. So if they're primarily Hispanic population or another population that doesn't engage in this sort of hairstyle, you'd want to use other types of examples that would build on students' cultural wealth. And then to implement this program, and I go into more detail in the paper, there's a whole profession development program where teachers are introduced in a summer workshop before they start the program. There's 4 follow-up Saturdays throughout the year. And then they actually come back for a second summer to learn about the curriculum. And the program in Chicago has tended to attract a big chunk of teachers who were from the career and technical ed, who taught computer science. And so for them, it's showing them a different way to teach computer science. That's not just a matter of, here's a coding problem, sit down, here's the language for how you do it, and have people spend time alone learning how to program, but doing it in a much more inquiry-based, collaborative way. There's also a large chunk of teachers who've never taught computer science before who are being introduced to the idea of teaching computer science. And for them, they're learning the computer science concepts while they're actually also learning about inquiry. And so what we're finding is that both groups of teachers, that exploring computer science is actually a shift in how they teach, but it's also something that is approachable for people who are doing it for the first time. Chicago was actually one of the first cities to actually adopt the Exploring Computer Science program outside of UCLA. But since that time, as of last year, there's 23 sites around the country that have adopted Exploring Computer Science, thanks in large part to funding from the National Science Foundation. Also, Code.org is a big funder of the expansion of the program nationwide, amongst other foundations that have been funding the profession development. So our prior research with the Taste of Computing project, which had presented, Ron Greenberg presented here last year about some of our early work, was focused on the surveys that we had administered to students. And what we found was that the extent to which students felt that the course was relevant to their lives predicted the extent to which they actually increased their interest in taking another computer science course, as well as going on and taking more computer science in college. And we found that the effect of that was mediated through this construct called expectancy value. And the expectancy value theory is something that's been developed over decades of research, and it's based on 2 constructs. One is, to what extent do I expect that I will do well in a particular discipline, which is somewhat related to self-efficacy. And the second is, to what extent do I value the discipline both for myself, but also as important for society. And when there's high perceptions on both of those dimensions, it's highly predictive of people's career choices, as well as their majors and their career choices down the road. There's a study I cite in the paper that actually looked at expectancy value at the middle school level and specifically around course selection, and found that yes, indeed, expectancy value is highly predictive of students actually taking information technology or computer science course. They did find that there are large differences in gender in who actually took those courses, but there are no gender differences in the extent to which if I have high expectancy value that actually go on to take that course selection. So what we wanted to look at this time around is to what extent did students' perceptions of the course and their expectancy value predict, did they actually go on to take another course? So as part of this data set that we got from the Chicago Public Schools, we're actually able to match that the students who took Exploring Computer Science and then looked several years later to see, did they actually register and take another computer science class? So ECS as a whole in those first 2 years reached over 4,600 students. Just under half were girls. 84% of the students identified as either Hispanic or African American. So there's a wide reach of underrepresented groups. Of that, there was about 26 schools that had participated in Taste of Computing early on. We were able to recruit 12 teachers in 7 schools to survey their students on our behalf. And within those schools, we were able to get about 418 out of the 950 students that had registered or were in those courses. And the demographics for those students were actually in line with the demographics of the school. It just turned out that the teachers that we were able to recruit tended to come from higher performing schools that were not as well represented of CPS as a whole. I go into details in the paper why we thought that was. So these are the variables that we were looking at. So first of all, it turned out that 75% of the students that took an ECS course went on to take another computer science class. So there's already a bias for those folks who were taking Exploring Computer Science to go on and take more computer science after that. We found that the students who were surveyed at the end of the course, about 2/3 of them did say that my interest in taking another computer science class actually increased. There was high relevance for the course, as well as students actually walked away with high value for computer science. On the expectancy dimension, only about 50% of the students actually rated themselves as high in expectancy, which for a first course and a first introduction to computer science, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to really move the needle on expectancy. We also got access to their Explorer, their GPA, as well as their course grade. And then we ran a regression looking at how all these factors actually predicted the extent to which the probability that students would actually go on to take another computer science course. Positive values means that that factor actually increased their probability that they would take another class. A negative value actually decreased the probability that they would take another class. I want to highlight, and what's interesting, you look at change in interest is actually negative. By itself, it actually has a positive correlation with taking another computer science class. But we did an interaction effect between your prior GPA and change in interest, which was statistically significant. And of course, it's always hard to interpret an interaction effect without looking at a graph. So actually, I have a graph here to help us understand what's actually going on. So for those students that decreased their interest in computer science, regardless of what their GPA was, they were right about the average. So they were likely in some sort of maybe the career track where they were already in line to take more computer science coursework. But what's interesting is that if I increased my interest in computer science, which was actually most of the students, that the higher your GPA, the higher the probability, the fact that you increased your interest had a larger effect. So it's something I think for us to think about in terms of the students who come into computer science that are lower performing, there's something going on there that we don't quite really understand. But as our takeaway point, so the limitations of this study was we did have a little bit of a slightly skewed population, and I think in the future we'll get more of a representative sample. But the overall takeaway is I think that Taste of Computing is actually supporting an expansion of exploring computer science. It's reaching underrepresented groups. For the most part, students are finding it to be a relevant course experience. And for that larger group, it is actually increasing the likelihood that they go on to actually take further computer science.
Wonderful.